So welcome everyone to the latest ICBE Advanced Productivity Skillnet webinar. And today we're joined by Dr. Karl Thomas from Ideation. Karl, his PhD was on the areas of critical thinking and innovation and creativity. He's a consultant and also a lecturer in the topic. Before I hand you over to Karl, just the ground rules for today. Karl will speak for about 15-20 minutes. We'll have 5 minutes Q&A at the end. And I ask, because everybody is muted, I would ask people to put their questions in on the chat function. And if you hover to the bottom of your screen, it will pop up what the chat function is. So any questions as they happen during the day, or any observation or any problems you're having with the session, please put them into chat. With no further ado, I'll hand you over to Dr. Karl Thomas. Thanks, Karl.
Thank you, Ron. Okay, so for the next 15 minutes or so, I'll be giving you an introduction to critical thinking in a continuous improvement environment, and hopefully it sort of piques some interest. We'll get started. If there's one thing that you take away from today, I would love for it to be this mantra, because it's just hugely beneficial in creating a lens for you to engage with the workplace. Nothing has ever been done so well that it can't be improved. And that's something that I bring into every company I work with, every group I work with, every space I go into. And it's something that I hold as a personal mantra. Because when you engage with this, you are immediately put into a space where you're looking for opportunities. When you're looking for opportunities, you're going to start to generate solutions. In the workplace, and I come across this quite often working with a range of different companies, and especially with HR departments, there's a huge engagement problem in the workplace. A recent Gallup study suggests that something close to 87% of staff are disengaged in the workplace. And obviously that creates obstacles, because your staff should be the people on the ground who are identifying opportunities for you to improve. I tend to tell companies they should be worried if staff aren't coming to them with questions or suggestions and ways to improve. And I would wonder how many people sitting at their desks now have either done that recently or have had staff come to them recently with that. So it's a hugely important mantra, but it's absolutely fundamental to the innovation mindset. Whether you're implementing Lean or Six Sigma or a Kaizen mindset, that mantra will help you to engage in a problem identifying or an opportunity identifying space. To achieve that, and as a critical theorist and critical thinker, questions are hugely important. And some of you will use the 5 whys, or go through the range of who, what, where, when, why, and how. I always say you should absolutely add to that what if, because having identified problems, your next step is solution orientated, and the what if is what will take you to the next step. I always encourage companies, staff, management leaders to encourage their staff to ask questions, to identify opportunities. And it's a case of questioning everything. Now, this can be difficult because the questioning mindset is often at odds with status management, and status management is something that we see as being quite an issue in the workplace, whereby people are afraid to ask questions in case it reflects negatively on them. One of the really important elements of critical thinking is we embrace intellectual humility, it's called in academic circles, but I tend to say it's a willingness to put yourself in a position where you can put your hand up and say, I don't understand, I don't know, I need to know more. Why do we do it like this? Why aren't we doing it like that? There are always opportunities in that. Even asking somebody, and we may get to them, is the standards of critical thinking. Clarity is the gateway standard of critical thinking. Asking somebody to clarify why they engage in a process a certain way can have the capacity to enlighten them to the fact that there are opportunities in that space to improve or refine or increase their output, reduce the range of wastes that are a possibility. So nothing's ever been done so well that it can't be improved, and then we engage in a questioning process. Some of you may have heard Owen and I talking about the future of work skills. And I do a lot of work around the 4 C's, so communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. These are being recognized as the must-have skills for the 21st century. And critical thinking for me is a sort of the foundational skill that informs the rest of these. Because if you are looking to become a better communicator, it's quite often the case that you need to critically engage with a person's context to understand not just how you communicate, but how they need to be communicated with. And having the ability to essentially empathize, understand, deconstruct their context, analyze, ask questions, and then synthesize that information in a way. And we do this in a branding context on a regular basis. I've worked in branding for quite a while as well with people, and it's about developing an understanding of the people you're trying to speak to. I always tell people to speak to me in a language I can hear. And that, of course, then facilitates collaboration, because the better you can communicate, the more or the greater your capacity for collaboration and incorporating other people's ideas and mindsets into a space. And then, of course, critical thinking, to my mind, is the absolute foundation of creativity. They're often seen as being sort of almost left side, right side brains elements. But I think without a strong capacity for critical thinking to recognize elements within an ecosystem, then you are not going to be in a position to generate good ideas. And we're going to come to that in a little bit more detail when I get down to the sort of the critical thinking section. If you Google something like skills of critical thinking, this is probably what you'll get: analysis, applying standards, discriminating, information seeking, logical reasoning, predicting, and transforming knowledge. I tend to find these things extremely dry. You engage with critical thinking after a time on an almost intuitive basis. Your capacity for analysis is fundamental to your ability as a critical thinker. To be able to walk into a space and to recognize the variables that impact that space is hugely, hugely important to your ability then to follow on in terms of applying standards. So again, recently at a conference, we were working with a group of engineers specifically around the concept of ethics in the engineering space and data research. And they had missed to a point the importance of critical thinking, and not just determining whether they should implement certain solutions, but the ongoing impact. And that's something, number 6 there says predicting. But in terms of critical thinking, you do learn to recognize the impact in terms of structure. When you implement a certain process at a certain point, you will immediately start to look at how that will knock on. Through your ability for logical reasoning, you learn to make solid inferences, and then take those inferences to absolutes, essentially recognizing that your source material, your knowledge and information is drawn from the most cogent sources possible. The source of your information is hugely valid, but I think that's another day's discussion. So this is one of my favorite references or quotes around critical thinking. The essence of critical thinking is suspended judgment, and the essence of this suspense is inquiry to determine the nature of the problem before proceeding to attempts at its solution. That's John Dewey. John Dewey is a famous pragmatist. But I'll go back to that for a moment. When we engage with a problem as opposed to a solution, it gives us the opportunity to absolutely codify what the problem is. And one of the things I look for quite often in the innovation space is a well-defined problem statement. Because we're inherently loss averse, we have a tendency to jump straight into, as humans, we're inherently loss averse. We have a tendency to jump straight to the solution because we want to solve the problem as quickly as possible. That doesn't always give us the opportunity to unpack what the problem actually is. And I see this quite often. I see people trying to implement solutions or shoehorn solutions into spaces where they haven't really defined what the problem is, and that solution doesn't always fit. And that can be hugely costly in terms of time, money, obviously. But what you tend to find is when you get these repeated losses because of that, then people start to lose engagement. They start to lose faith in their process, and they tend to remove themselves in those spaces. One of the things I'm quite often asked is to help staff think outside the box. And for me, as a critical thinker, I immediately start to try to get people to define, well, what is your box? Because if you're going to go on any kind of journey, you need a destination, but also a starting point. You need to identify where you're beginning from. And that's hugely, hugely important in a critical thinking context. The more capable you are as a critical thinker to analyze your context, that essentially allows you to predict and strategize how you're going to move between point A and point B. Your ability to recognize, again, the kind of variables that impact, but also the kind of variables that dictate your space are important. We talk about things like SWOT or PESTLE or any of those kind of analytical tools that we'll use in the workplace. But again, with something as simple as SWOT, where you're determining the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, or threats. Again, a capacity for deep analysis, a capacity for predicting, a capacity for strategizing based on that will allow you to turn SWOT from a box ticking exercise into a deeply nuanced tool that can be applied in a way that will absolutely create a competitive advantage. This is something I use quite often as a sort of an icebreaker almost for people. When I'm working with them around defining the box, I basically show this image and ask people to rationalize why they're wearing what they're wearing on that day. And what you tend to get is a sort of a superficial response in the sense that you'll get, well, they were the only clean clothes I had, or they were, the only clothes that weren't creased, or I picked them up off the floor. But when we take something as simple as why you're wearing what you're wearing and unpack that, and you look at the fact that uniforms have a certain kind of impact, or your clothes communicate something within a specific cultural structure, you start to see that you're making decisions without being aware that those decisions are being made. They're subconscious or unconscious decision making. And that also feeds into your capacity for engaging with certain cognitive bias or heuristics. But I would offer you the opportunity at some point to try this, literally to sit back and make note of all of the reasons you can think of. Not just why you're wearing them, but why you bought them, the level of availability of them, the influence or impact of other people around you. But it's an innocuous introduction to the critical thinking process. And it's a very, very useful tool, especially when you're in a room. I'm quite often in a room with maybe 40 or 50 people or 100 people, and you get them to start questioning each other around this. You see the real scope of our decision making, and something as simple as why you're wearing a particular jumper or t-shirt or shirt, and how that sort of subconscious or unconscious decision making can actually permeate through your workplace or your workday. In the context of sort of critical thinking and the continuous improvement environment, and this absolutely impacts people on a personal basis, but also on a much broader context in the workplace. As I said, if you want to be moving towards a specific destination, you have to identify your origin, and you have to do that as critically as possible. We give out sort of assessment forms in certain of the workshops, and you're looking for people to give you a kind of an assessment of themselves. And some people are obviously extremely negative. Some people are quite positive about themselves. You're looking to find a comfortable middle ground in that, because within that sort of critical engagement with the self, and we'll look at a quick reflection process. When you have critically assessed yourself, self-reflection, it shows you where the opportunities are for you to improve. And we want to move beyond the fixed mindset whereby we think you either can or you can't, and you're born that way. Critical thinking is similar to creativity in the sense that it's a muscle. It's not something you're born capable of or more capable of. It's your exposure to it in terms of opportunity. So obviously for me, I've had a huge amount of opportunity over the years, and especially over the course of a PhD, where you're constantly pushed into a space where you have to challenge and identify your own bias and your own thinking and overcome that. So certainly, the impact of critical thinking in terms of a growth mindset, it will help you to identify opportunities, but it'll also help you to identify the path necessary to move from the position you're in now to your eventual goal. So in terms of innovation and critical thinking, what we tend to find, a quick definition of innovation is essentially any invention that adds value. Now, it doesn't have to be a product, it's obviously also services, but it's the value that determines the difference between invention and innovation. This is something that I introduce to people at specifically innovation workshops. It's the diffusion of innovation theory, and it's old, but it's not outdated. And recent research actually suggests that it's still very much the case that only 2.5% of people fit into the innovation or the innovators section. So what that essentially means is that the vast majority of us are outside of that innovators space. And I would be inclined to suggest that there are a range of cultural reasons why that's the case. Because so many of us are normalized into a specific mindset of thinking. So when we look at the likes of the clothing example that I used a second ago, a lot of our decisions are based on a process of normalization. And when you walk into your workspace, you have a tendency to engage based on how the vast majority of people in that space engage. Having the willingness to step outside of that and ask questions should be peer-based. And that's what we talk about in terms of normalization, that you make it normal within that space to ask questions. And what that allows you to do is take this diffusion of innovation theory and start to shift the balance towards innovators. The more people in your space asking questions, the more people in your space who are immediately engaged with the workplace, which is hugely important because an engaged staff, I mean, I'm sure plenty of you are aware of the 80-20 rule, 80% of the input for 20% of the output. So you want a greater level of engagement from a much greater level or amount of staff to then increase the opportunity for innovation in your space. This is the design thinking model, and some of you may be familiar with it. It essentially breaks down the design process into 5 stages. Without a shadow of a doubt, critical thinking underpins each of these stages. Most importantly, though, I would say for me, the first 2, empathy and define, because as I said, defining the problem is hugely, hugely important. Now, what the design thinking model does is it moves the traditional problem space, solution space, the double diamond design process into the human-centric element. In saying that, the double diamond still engages with exploring and understanding problem or opportunity for different perspectives. Now, one of my big mantras is a problem well defined is a problem half solved. And that's paraphrasing Charles Kettering's, the famed engineer who worked for General Motors and was an inventor. That's paraphrasing his, because without sort of taking away anything from this, context is king. People talk about content being king, but in a design or problem solving space, context is king. Understanding your client's values, the necessity, and of course, your client isn't always external to the company. We quite often talk about internal and external clients or customers, and they're the people who work around you in a supply chain process. Your internal customers, I believe, should be all of the people along that supply chain. How do I improve what I do better so I can better engage with the people who are next in line, and we keep moving towards that. And that's, again, it's about critical thinking. It's about engaging with these people. It's about understanding their process as well as is necessary. Getting a sense of what they say, what they do, what they think, and how they feel. And in the innovation space, and certainly in the startup space, how people feel is hugely important, because that's where you identify the stressors and pain points. And having a capacity for analysis, being able to listen to people, understand that 2 people can use the exact same words, the same vocabulary, and understanding their context will enlighten you to the fact that they're actually saying quite different things. I'll move down because I'm conscious of the time. So this is something we have to be conscious of. It's cognitive bias and heuristics. Heuristics are essentially the shorthand or rule of thumb that we use to apply to solve problems quickly. And I mentioned to Owen earlier, the Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, references this quite a bit. So we have a range of them. I just took note of a couple. So belief observance, our brains will go to a place without our conscious engagement, whereby we will ignore certain facts. We will include certain elements that don't exist to maintain our belief. And this can actually have a huge impact in the workplace, because we have a tendency to engage more readily with ideas that we like. We have a tendency to dismiss ideas that we don't like without understanding the impact of our preference as being a factor in that decision-making process. And that's something we have to recognize. And we do that by a process of reflection. I see this quite often when you're trying to implement new innovative solutions or services, and people have a tendency to be resistant to them because it's taking them away from a space that they're comfortable in. And belief preservance is one of the processes that our brain engages with to basically maintain our sense of control in that space. Something like affect bias, I mentioned it again briefly to Owen there earlier. Something as simple as our emotional state at a particular time will have an incredible impact on our decision making. And it's understanding what has created that emotional space and the impact that that emotional space has. So literally something like being hungry and being in an engagement with somebody that you're not especially happy with at the time because all you're thinking about is eating your sandwich for lunch will impact your decision making in that space. Again, we are inherently loss averse. As humans, we have a tendency to avoid situations that create loss much more quickly than we will engage with situations that present opportunity for advancement. In saying that, and because of that, we can introduce new processes into the workplace, we can introduce new opportunities into the workplace. But if it means bringing somebody into a space that they're not immediately comfortable with, or that's difficult, or that is potentially harmful to their status in that space, you will find that there will be resistance, and you will experience that yourself. I experience it, and everybody does, and it's not one of those things you can immediately circumnavigate without being critically engaged with the self. So what you'll have a tendency to do is almost consolidate as opposed to expand. And again, your capacity for critical thinking will help you to recognize when this is happening, when you are engaging in a negativity bias or a loss averse mindset, and foregoing opportunity rather than putting yourself into an uncomfortable space. This is one I engage with so often. A company will invest a huge amount into a particular process that eventually doesn't work. Now, this happens because they haven't altogether defined the problem, but that's another issue. What you will find quite often is, and I hear this quite often, but a lot of work went into producing these regulations. If those regulations aren't fit for purpose, if this system doesn't work, if this process doesn't work, get rid of it. There is no point in maintaining a process that doesn't serve its overall purpose, purely because on a subconscious level, your brain is recognizing all of the work and it's weighing it based on that. We have to be ruthless, essentially. There's one process that will teach you about being ruthless. If any of you ever get the opportunity or have done a PhD, you will know that it takes you a huge amount of time to produce a small amount of work. And at certain points throughout the process, you have to cut that out. You're always engaging with that amount of work based on an emotional basis as opposed to a critical objective basis. I appreciate that this is not immediately easy to read, but it's just a useful codex that gives you a sense of the range of obstacles your brain sets for you that make it extremely difficult to function on a daily basis in a sort of a more fluid manner. But all of these sort of obstacles are subconscious. They're buried deep in your brain. They're based on millennia of evolution. Quite a lot of them exist in the reptilian brain, like one of our earliest stages of evolution, but they are still present and they still have an impact on how you engage in the world today. A useful reflection process that I use with quite a few people is basically the Gibbs reflection cycle. And it's you objectively describe what happens, then you incorporate your feelings based on that objective reflection. You evaluate what was good or bad about the experience. You analyze what else can you make of the situation. That's hugely important, especially in the innovation space, because there's so much opportunity for failure. It's hugely important to analyze any kind of failure, because within that there is opportunity to learn. And that's a whole other talk that I do in terms of failing forward, but it is necessary. And then you draw a conclusion, and your conclusion is based on creating an action plan and moving forward. So I often tell people that we are reflecting, essentially looking back for the sake of moving forward. This is a very, very basic model that we use in terms of critical thinking and introducing critical thinking into the workplace. you recognize your assumptions. We are all capable of assumptions, and regardless of the length of time I've spent in the area of critical thinking and critical theory, I still have to manage my own assumptions because they have a tendency to get into your brain before, as I said, you're thinking fast and slow. Your assumptions are the fast thinking. They're the heuristics. They're the ones that jump to the head of the line. Your capacity for critical thinking is much slower to engage. So it does take time to take a breath, step back, and give yourself space to analyze and recognize your assumptions. You evaluate your arguments. You base your arguments on as solid a foundation of fact and logic as possible, and based on that, you draw conclusions. I tend not to like box ticking exercises because the critical thinking process is quite fluid. It becomes a skill set, and I often relate it to sport as opposed to many other things, because within the 90 minutes of a football match or the range of a rugby match, you're going to incorporate a range of different skills that you've learned. And it's about how you adapt to very specific situations in those contexts, rather than being a direct A, B, C, D process. So I suppose wrapping up, I would say intellectual humility, having the ability and willingness to say, I don't know, and then using that as a starting point for a journey, as opposed to it being an admittance of failure. And then curiosity is absolutely key to the critical thinking process. When you have a staff that are engaged, they will be curious, because identifying opportunities, identifying problems, creates opportunities for solutions, which creates opportunity for reward. So I think that's it. I'll leave it at that. And I'm sorry if I went on a little long there, but
no problem. Thanks very much, Karl. And if there's any questions, if you would input them into the chat. But one that I had was just around, is there a natural starting place for people who want to, explore the power of critical thinking within their organizations? Is there not just starting point from the department, or even just within management, or where should they begin?
Well, I mean, it's something as simple as that Gibbs reflection model that's included in the presentation there is a useful introduction to the critical thinking process. I mean, it's about giving yourself time, but if you go through something as simple as that the Gibbs model, just stopping to take time and analyze any situation based on those steps will give you a good introduction, a mental introduction to it. In terms of reading around it, as I said, that book, the Thinking Skills for Professionals, is a useful one. It's a very accessible book. I've recommended it to quite a few people, and I think the structure of the book works really well. That will help you. It gives you a good introduction to the likes of argumentation in terms of critical thinking, which is another area, but it gives you, what I found quite useful is it breaks down some of the cognitive bias elements and heuristics. It also breaks down sort of the fallacies of thinking as well. So, and the fallacies within terms of your cognitive bias and how they're all interrelated. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. And just one final one, if there's any particularly good example, you gave a good example of a company who didn't really invest in critical thinking product. I'm just curious if there is a company or organization that's blazing the trail. What company would be a good one to look at in terms of having
okay, well,
so, or is it more individual than that?
So somebody like Johnny Ives at Apple is, to me, a good example of a critic. He's the main designer for Apple. Now, Apple will produce good products, but the real success of Apple is the design. It's the way they engage with their client base, and it's his capacity to go out into that space, have created a suitable destination, and moved from his point of origin right the way through that process. To me, there's real evidence of critical thinking there, because what he's also done is he's also looked at the history of design as well, and he's borrowed hugely from a guy named Dieter Rams. But it's his ability, again, to pick specific elements from Dieter Rams' work to incorporate into the Apple aesthetic. And to me, you know, as a designer, his work is impressive, but it's the thinking behind it that's really interesting, because it's not just that it's aesthetically pleasing. It fits the broader concept of Apple. It fits with the lifestyle modeling of the Apple brand and how that's going to fit in, and also to a degree dictate how other elements should fit with it within a product ecosystem. So I would certainly say Apple are a good example, and obviously there are certain elements of Steve Jobs and his capacity to identify opportunities. I mean, Amazon is another good example of somebody who's critically engaged with this space, seeing this Jeff Bezos recognize his own skill set, recognize an opportunity, and then didn't stop at that particular opportunity, critically engaged with the technology that was about to come online, and saw opportunities in that to start to implement new endeavors, essentially. So, you know, you will see evidence of critical thinking in these spaces. But to me, I think Johnny Ives is a really good example of a strong critical thinker at Apple. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much, Karl. Just before we wrap up, just to let everyone know that our ICBE National Conference Pathway to Global Excellence is the theme for this year. Will be held on April the 4th, and you'll be getting some information on that. And the Energy Symposium is still open for submissions. It's free to attend, and it takes place at the end of the month on Thursday the 28th in Ashford Castle, and then the March 1st in Collin Village. And finally, Karl, can I thank you for your time? I know that was probably a very quick speed through on what is a difficult topic, but you've certainly given some tools and stuff that we'll be collating later on. We will collate it into blog post, and we will have the video from today's session that we can share later on. So thank you very much, Karl.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody.